Hi everyone, my name is Gavrila. I'll be presenting a paper co-authored with Lisa Loverbey and Francisco Ramirez. And the title of our presentation today is Performing Diversity, a historical and organizational analysis on the rise of diversity-related offices in American universities between 1968 and 2018. And for the rest of this presentation, I'll be referring to diversity-related offices by the acronym DROs. We begin with a quote from the National Association of Student Personnel Administrators. They posit that the concept of diversity is not new. It's been around for quite some time, and in fact, every few years, it seems to be reinvented. There's a new term that essentially captures similar ideas and values. And examples from recent years include terms such as pluralism, intercultural communication, cross-cultural competency, social justice, and so on. In conclusion, campuses are encouraged to employ the terminology that best fits their institution. This is germane to our study because in coding the presence of a DRO at universities as well as the year when they were first founded, we had to contend with this, with the different terms under which those offices are known. This list captures 4 of the more common terms associated with DROs. Sometimes those are used interchangeably. We sometimes see all of them used in the title of a DRO or in various combinations. In terms of the theoretical perspectives for our study, as the title suggests, we take first, the historical perspective by which the rise of diversity offices is linked to wider social movements that expanded the minority franchise in the US, starting with the social movements of the 1960s. But we also take an organizational perspective by which we mean the organizational expansion of universities across the board, as well as the institutionalization of diversity at all levels of management. For our conceptual framework, we've identified 2 main logics that could explain the rise of DROs over the past 50 years. The first logic can be summarized as a social justice or compliance logic. This refers to DROs acting to improve access to higher education for historically marginalized groups. The second logic can be summarized as multiculturalism or inclusion logic. And in that point of view, DROs act to enhance quality of education for all students. In terms of our research questions, we start with, when do universities set up DROs? We then ask, what accounts for differences between universities in terms of the year in which they found their respective DRO? And finally, how can we model the diffusion of DROs in the entire population of universities over time? Because we're hoping to employ event history and risk analyses, it's important to keep in mind the temporal aspect of this phenomenon. The timeline we're presenting here is pointing out different moments in time that we hypothesize might have played a role in the decision of certain universities to adopt DROs on their campuses. Some of those dates capture landmark case studies or years in which affirmative action bans in higher education were passed in various states. But also, if I could draw your attention to the year 2003, that's the year when the Ford Foundation partnered with the American Association of Colleges and Universities to disburse a series of grants around what it called the Inclusive Excellence Initiative. And this is related to the second logic that we've presented earlier. In terms of our data, we start with a sample of 263 universities that is essentially a combined sample of a nationally representative sample, which has been stratified by region and institutional control, but also an elite sample, non-representative sample of 28 universities, commonly known as the Ivy Plus group. And you can see in the table on this slide the distribution of those universities across the 2 samples. Overall, we have 61 universities which are private, 61% of universities that are private compared to 39% of universities that are public in that combined sample. We also think it would be a good idea to highlight different subgroups in our analysis. We have already determined that there are some subgroups that could be of interest in the eventual modeling. We have about 10 universities which are categorized as state flagship institutions. 60 universities in our sample are in states that have passed affirmative action legislation bans at some point. And 50 universities in our sample are also members of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, which again, we think would be related to a classic diffusion study. In terms of our variables, the first one, DRO office, is simply a dummy variable that captures whether a university currently has a DRO. This was conducted through web census in 2016-18 and revisited for accuracy and updates in 2019-2020. The last two variables, this is where the historical data comes in. Those are the actual years when a university first developed its DRO, regardless of what terminology they favored. And the last variable, DI year, is the year when the university first set up an office, a DRO office that uses one of those magic words, 3 magic words: diversity, equity, or inclusion. And the last two variables were collected through a combination of web census, phone calls, and email exchanges with university representatives in the last 2 years, most notably with archivists at those universities who often hold the information, the historical information we're looking for. So we have about 75% of universities in the consolidated sample with DROs. That's 100% in the elite sample and 64% in the random sample. Overall, that's quite a high number in our sample. And of those 75% of universities with DROs, we know the DRO founding date, an approximate or exact founding date for 67% of those universities. And again, that percentage is higher in the elite sample compared to the random sample. We are hoping to use some data imputation methods to get some additional information and raise that percentage a bit if possible in the future. In terms of our hypotheses, I will be presenting them here in 2 sets. The first set aligns more with the social justice and legal logic that I presented earlier. It basically states that early adopters of DROs can be predicted based on institutional features. And the sub-hypotheses 1A, 1B, and 1C explore those different correlations that we expect to see. The second and third hypotheses explore a possible lagged effect that we might see between state passing affirmative action legislation or milestone legal decisions taking place in the outer environment and the decision of particular universities to develop DROs. And finally, the fourth hypothesis states that more universities, especially public universities, are likely to develop DROs after Title IX mandatory reporting legislation is passed. In terms of the second logic, multiculturalism and inclusion, this is more where the classic diffusion imagery comes into play. We hypothesize that more universities, regardless of institutional features, will develop DROs post-2003. And that's the year when the Ford Foundation disbursed its Inclusive Excellence grants. We also will be exploring whether membership in different national organizations can be used to predict later adopters of DROs. And finally, we think that later adopters can also be predicted based on geographical proximity to other adopters or the behavior of peer institutions as well as actualized critical mass in the total population of universities. So essentially, once more than 50% of universities in the total population have adopted DROs, the rest will soon follow suit. Our preliminary findings are in the form of longitudinal data, which I will present next. This graph captures the cumulative percentage of universities with known DROs. And as you can see, most of those offices appear to have been founded since the 1990s. However, about 30% of them were founded since 1968, so in the 70s and 80s. The earliest date a university founded its DRO in our data set is 1968. The second graph shows when those offices start to be named diversity, equity, or inclusion. And as you can see, it's only since the late 1990s and certainly in the last 2 decades that those offices start popping up. However, DI, as mentioned earlier, is a subset of DRO. So this superimposed graph shows that relationship, but it also captures the fact that those timelines are quite a bit different. We explored whether elite universities from our elite subsample behave differently compared to the universities in the random sample. And it does appear that the DROs came earlier at some of those elite universities, but we also had universities in the nationally representative sample who founded their DROs in the 70s and 80s. In terms of the public-private distinction, we see virtually no difference in whether universities that are public versus universities that are private will be like when they will be adopting those DROs. And finally, what you have here is a hazard rate of DRO foundings using a Nelson-Allen estimator. And what we're looking for here is spikes. That's when new offices were founded from the population of universities that hadn't yet adopted them. And we see the first spike in the 70s. That's when the earliest DROs get established. Quite a cluster of spikes in the 1990s. That's when a lot of the landmark cases and compliance starting to have an effect on universities. And finally, a sizable hike since the 2000s, and that again could be associated with the influence of the Ford Foundation on the higher education landscape. What does it mean to perform diversity? We have been using the word perform in this presentation, and we want to acknowledge that university DROs are performative organizational structures. They signal to external stakeholders that universities care about diversity and are willing to invest resources in establishing formal offices in that regard. We also use the term perform to actually capture the fact that some universities perform better than others on the metrics that we've looked for in this study. They set up their DROs earlier than other universities, and they establish more elaborate and sometimes multiple forms of DROs. That's all from us. Thank you very much for watching. And if you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to contact us by email. Thank you.